Chapter 26. Courted.
And then it exploded, right in his face. I'm talking little slivers sticking out of his skin like a porcupine's rear end.
Hiccup sighed as laughter roared, trailing Halfdan's greatly exaggerated account of Fremheria's temperament. His face itched and he wanted to rub the area that still bore raw, red scars from the splintered shot of a former arrow. At this point, Hiccup was certain he bore more scars from self-inflicted accidents than anyone he knew. Halfdan regaled his fellows with tales not of Hiccup's first failed test of Fremheria, but his 7th or 8th. They were starting to blur together at this point. Naturally, Hiccup tried a few more arrows after the first burst into flame, all of which met with the same fiery fate. The weeks that followed the initial failure consisted of Hiccup experimenting in the forge with different materials, trying to create a projectile that would please the testy weapon, almost all of which were destroyed before he could draw the string to its limit. It was frustrating, to say the least. He felt let down, challenged, annoyed, and cheated. Sometimes he wanted to shake Fremheria, especially the times that left him in pain, but the fear of Thor's reaction to such mistreatment kept his frustrations contained. Aside from dropping her time and time again, he wouldn't give up. A month of failed experiments had surely put a damper on his spirits, but it also drove him to obtain the answer. It always did. Hiccup even once made an arrow of iron ore, thinking Fremheria wanted a material to better match her element. For one wonderful moment, Hiccup believed it would work because the arrow did not immediately catch fire or explode. It melted. By reaction, Hiccup dropped everything in his grasp as soon as the unbearable burn, straight through the gloves, registered in his fingers, but the damage had been done. His hands needed the immediate care of Yazon, who, upon hearing the full details of what had happened, nearly strangled Hiccup with the rest of the bandage roll. He probably would have, too, had Toothless not been watching the healer with a sharp eye. A good week had passed since Hiccup made his latest attempt at firing. The pain and fate of the iron arrow discouraged him from further testing for the time being, at least until his hands healed. In the meantime, he did what he could in the forge, even if the heat of the place only served to agitate the healing burns further. Hiccup feared he would have to make an arrow of gold to appease Fremheria. Sure, the materials would be given to him if he sent Toothless with a request, but at present time, further attempts with metals sounded rather unappealing. Gold was softer, easily malleable, but that much more likely to turn into molten pain. Hiccup absently pouted at the fingers recently freed from their bandages. He wanted to pick at the blisters, but Yazon made it quite clear that he was to do no such thing. Apparently they were necessary? Fremheria may not even be made of gold. She was probably just shiny. Hiccup snorted at his own private reasoning. If that were the case, then making gold arrows would be just as much a waste of time as the rest were. He had other things he could be doing. The young man tipped the last of his undersized drink into his mouth. The alcohol lost its flavor a while ago, now it just felt smooth and warm down his throat. He had taken a liking to this amber liquid. The first few sips from the tiny glass were so bitter it bit at the back of his tongue and throat. But he continued drinking, not liking the way Halfdan watched him, grinning as if issuing a silent challenge. A second glass was soon presented to him, and Hiccup downed it in one go as he saw the other Viking do with theirs. His throat still ached from the first one, and the second managed to slide on by under the camouflage of its predecessor. Hiccup's head felt a little warm, and his body relaxed, so his third glass he sipped like the first. He would not lose his head around people like this, no matter how accustomed to them he grew. The alcohol, Raji, he couldn't quite recall, made his present company more bearable, but only just. After much pestering, Halfdan finally managed to drag Hiccup into his most frequented tavern. Truthfully, Hiccup felt like he could use a drink, and only held off for as long as he did, because he didn't want to give the obtuse man the illusion that they were friends. This particular tavern turned out to be a favorite for many Varinjar, run by an immigrant Norseman, where no language barrier kept a man from getting his drink on. The inside was decorated in rough, polished oaks, and the lack of windows and glut of candles gave the warm, stodgy feeling of home in the middle of a foreign land. On any other day, Hiccup would have enjoyed the setting. Being surrounded by Vikings, with no desire to restrict their drinking as he had, spoiled the comfort of the situation. A meaty hand, tipped in grime-crusted nails, slammed on the varnished table next to Hiccup's drink, shocking the liquid into harsh ripples. Hiccup trailed his eyes up the arm and onto the face of a familiar but nameless Viking. The man's eyes were slightly unfocused, and the curls of his thick beard glistened with dribbled booze.
So, you cannot even use that bow?
He asked, confident he had Hiccup's full attention.
After all you did to get it?
The man's breath wafted across the table, and Hiccup, wrinkling his nose, pulled his drink back into the safety of his hands.
I can still use it,
he insisted, pausing for a sip. He needed it.
I can hit you across the head with it, and your brain will be fried before you ever even knew it was there.
The Viking blinked, completely missing the insult thrown in at the end.
Good point, that.
Hiccup didn't know if the man was simply dim-witted, or if the alcohol consumption affected his mind that much.
Oi!
Halfdan piped in from Hiccup's left.
You wouldn't have gotten that bow if you didn't come here. Remember that.
I wouldn't have gotten a lot of things if I didn't come here,
Hiccup pointed out darkly. Usually such reminders would earn him a brief but satisfying look of shame from the redhead. Unfortunately, Halfdan had plenty to drink as well, and he grinned cheekily in reply. A bit put out, Hiccup added,
Besides, you don't know that I wouldn't have gotten it. It could have been presented to me at any time.
Nah,
Halfdan dismissed. He made a waving motion with his hand, but miscalculated his control over it, coming within the hair's breadth of knocking over some other Viking's drink.
It's a weapon of fate, that bow. Time and place matter.
He looked rather self-important in that moment, nodding to himself as though he were delivering very wise information.
You were meant to come here so you could get that bow. Simple as that.
I don't agree,
Hiccup intoned. He glanced down at the bottom of his drink, a touch dismayed. He supposed he could get one more in him and still be fine. Halfdan looked scandalized.
How can you not agree? The fates brought you here.
My dragon brought me here.
You steered the dragon here,
Halfdan corrected, as if he knew anything.
We both decided to come here.
Hiccup was starting to get annoyed. Where was that damn barkeep?
Why?
Halfdan asked, bluntly.
Huh?
Hiccup murmured, still distracted.
Why did you want to come here?
He asked again.
The sights, the ladies, the cats? Oi, barkeep, get over here and get us another round.
Hiccup jumped at the sheer volume Halfdan managed to acquire so quickly. A moment later, and the elusive tavern owner was at their table, refreshing the empty glasses. So that's how it was done.
No,
Hiccup answered the man, considerably more willing now that Halfdan helped him out.
My mother grew up here. I wanted to see how she spent her childhood.
Ah,
Halfdan said, picking his own glass.
Seeking out old family members.
Hiccup shook his head.
No, she traveled pretty much her whole life, but her family spent most of her childhood here.
Hiccup trailed off as a bizarre but obvious realization wormed its way through the weight of alcohol clouding his mind and struck him right behind the eyes. For the first time, it occurred to him that someone might remember her. Someone still in Miklagard.
Valka?
He blurted out quickly, unstoppably.
That was her name. Do you know her?
Halfdan put no thought into the question.
Nope. Oi, guys!
He hollered above the din. Of the mess of squabbling Vikings, half turned to give their attention, the rest falling to their drinks. Hiccup could feel his face heat, and an unnatural squeak escaped his throat. Why was Halfdan dragging everyone into this? He only asked him. Surely he wouldn't...
Any of you fools remember Valka?
Shut up,
Hiccup hissed.
It's Valka.
The immediate surrounding attention they received cut off the rest of his words.
No,
one Viking spoke up.
Is that a woman? Of course, another piped in. That's a woman's name, ain't it?
A cluster of voices followed, amplifying.
Sounds a lot like Valkyrie. She a Valkyrie? She sounds like a fine woman. Fine woman. Sounds like she got curves. I like a curvy girl myself. Let's find her. I always wanted to try for a Valkyrie.
It's my mother,
Hiccup snapped before they trod on territory he, as her son, should never be subjected to.
Your mother's a Valkyrie?
A lone, stupid voice broke through, and it all went to hell from there.
That's right, he got that bow from Thor. Bleeding troll ballbacks, that's why he's alive. And immortal? Can I touch him? Why didn't we figure this out before now? Why did I convert? I could have had heirs with a Valkyrie.
Hiccup knocked back the rest of his drink and turned to Halfdan, who looked positively delighted at this development.
I hate you.
Hiccup coughed, overestimating his tolerance of the liquid.
Well, is it true?
Halfdan asked, half serious. Hiccup answered him with a full glare. Somehow, in all the inane commotion, more drinks had appeared. Hiccup gladly grabbed the next one. Just one more. He'd be fine. Toasts began popping up around them.
To Valkyries! To the Empress! To Basil! Basil!
Another wailed, sloshing more of his drink out of the cup than was left in it.
Aye, to Basil!
Do I even want to ask what Basil is?
Hiccup muttered to the man who he was still annoyed with.
Ah, that'd be the Emperor before Empress Zoe,
Halfdan answered, scratching at his ear.
Wasn't around for much of his rule myself, but he knew how to run a bleeding country, he did,
one Viking shouted. He slammed his hand on the table. Hiccup suspected it was the same one who did the table slapping before, but they were all starting to look alike.
No truer statement,
agreed another voice.
Basil was a great man,
a different Viking told Hiccup solemnly, appearing at his right.
A great, great man. Ninnies, Halfdan snorted. Though I suppose they have a point. The Empire's just holding form, but only just. Apparently Basil had no heirs of his own, and, well, things just get messy when there's no heirs around.
Hiccup nodded absently, trying not to think of the situation he left his father in. The setting wasn't helping. He felt like he could stand up from the crowd and find himself back in the mead hall. Maybe it was time to get out of there before some sick form of nostalgia took hold of him.
Supposedly, Basil set the standard for employers.
Halfdan went on, heedless of Hiccup's thoughts.
Harold's been saying for ages that it was time to get out of here. When the Emperor changes, part of our agreement is we get to raid the treasury. I think he's been waiting for Zoe to get kicked out, or step down, or leave or summit. Wants to take advantage of all his time put in here. Of course, these days, I think his patience wearing a bit thin. He's been getting more and more ballsy. Just right now he's with that girl that,
I don't know that girl,
Hiccup told him. He didn't care how off Harold's behavior was. The only thing that interested him was another allusion to a new emperor. It sounded like things might get messy if something happened to Zoe's position, and spending more time on getting Toothless's flying gear into shape sounded like a better and better plan.
Oi, what's her name again?
Halfdan called to the Vikings, who were toasting Odin knows what at this point, once again bringing them unnecessarily into the conversation.
Who? The girl Harold's with right now.
There was a round of ahs and much nudging before someone answered.
Marcy, I think. Maria, you lummox, it's Maria. Ah, Maria, that's it,
Halfdan recalled brightly. He turned back to Hiccup.
He's with Zoe's niece, Maria. Likes her a fair bit, he does. She's a pretty thing, I can see the attraction. I like a bigger woman myself, particularly around the hips.
Hiccup felt a bit uncomfortable on the subject of who Harold was with, but something struck him as odd.
Doesn't Zoe want to marry him or something?
Harold hit the table with his palm, a buoyant laugh escaping his lips.
That's the kicker in it. He don't want her, he wants her niece. She does what she can to separate them, but, as you can imagine, that don't do too much to discourage things. Harold's already threatened to run off with the lass if Zoe didn't stop interfering with his business.
Hiccup's eyebrows rose, the drink that he lifted falling a bit from his lips. That sounded like a serious attitude to him. To say something like that to an empress... Halfdan's hand came down and slapped him on the shoulder.
I bet you could grab any girl you want and just fly off with her.
The affectionate tap jerked Hiccup, and some of his drink escaped from its container, splashing onto the table in several droplets. Hiccup stared at the liquid, realizing somewhere in the back of his mind that he should be more upset at how upset he was over the loss of the drink.
But I wouldn't want to do that,
Hiccup pointed out, mentally cringing at the thought.
That would be troublesome.
Halfdan rolled his eyes.
Well, not to keep her, obviously. You'd be able to snatch her up for however long you needed her and just drop her back in the middle of the night.
Hiccup knew he must have borne a vaguely horrified look on his face because Halfdan began waving his hands in the air, hollering,
Consensual! Consensual!
The man had no concept of volume control. Hiccup took a long inhale through his nose, regretting it as soon as a scent that could only be described as sloppy invaded his senses.
Regardless of what I am capable of doing, I have no desire to snatch her from anywhere for any period of time.
Sweet Freya. He had just created a hypothetical girl with Halfdan. It was time to leave. It was so time to leave. Halfdan snorted at Hiccup's avowal.
Of course you do, you punce. Yeah, oh no.
The man had gone from cocky to appalled, and the time it took Hiccup to swallow a mouthful of his drink.
What now?
Hiccup sighed, not really caring for any more theatrics. Halfdan turned fully to face him, his visage the epitome of grim.
How old are you?
Halfdan asked the question with such seriousness that Hiccup felt compelled to answer.
Nearly 17.
He started to feel offset by Halfdan's ever-changing manners.
And you have never experienced a woman?
Hiccup, who had been ready for another sip of his drink, lurched forward, slamming the bottom of the glass into the table.
What?
His voice cracked. It hadn't cracked in ages.
You are not a man yet,
Halfdan announced, louder, pointing an accusing finger at Hiccup on top of it all. Hiccup immediately slapped the hand down.
Shut up!
How did this happen? How?
Oh, gosh, can we not go there?
Halfdan could no longer hear the younger man, lost to his own disbelieving grumbles.
You ride a dragon. How can you not?
Just shut up,
Hiccup snapped.
It's not any of your business. Who cares?
He tried to keep the flush from his cheeks, but the alcohol had already opened the floodgates for extreme blushing.
I said I'd do right by you,
Halfdan muttered, shaking his head in disgruntlement. He stood up, abruptly, setting the bench back with a loud screech.
Unbelievable. On the road, all over the world, and still.
Hiccup didn't know what to do. He'd never seen Halfdan this serious before.
That...
Halfdan spun, once again pointing his thick finger in Hiccup's face.
You. Stay put.
Hiccup was too mortified to do anything. He watched, mute, as Halfdan marched off into a thicker area of the tavern, then let out a long breath. While he never planned on letting anyone know of his experience, or lack thereof, he certainly didn't expect a reaction of that magnitude. Certainly not from Halfdan. Hiccup shook his head, throwing from his mind that hated sense of inadequacy. Who cares what Halfdan thought? Yes, he was on the road, but that made it all the more unlikely he would find someone to... Hiccup sighed again, rubbing his forehead. He couldn't bring himself to shack up with a random woman simply for bragging rights. True, he didn't find the thought of marriage appealing at all, and on more than one occasion wondered if he'd ever gain more experience with women than kisses in an otherworldly dimension. He tried, in increasing frequency, to avoid thoughts of that nature, tried to make it a habit. He was traveling with a dragon, and while male, Toothless still had a lot to learn about humans. The discordant and grating hubbub of drunken Vikings singing finally reached a level that broke through his maddening thoughts.
We are loyal warriors, that's the oath we gave, to protect the Emperor, even to a violent grave.
Hiccup raised an eyebrow, watching as these men threw their menacing images to the wind and swayed as they sang, arms around shoulders and tankards held high in the air.
Our loyalty was always firm. We kept our given word on the southern battlefields. Our northern war cries roared.
Hiccup looked around the adjoining tables. Those who weren't singing drunkenly were passed out, foreheads pressed against the grains and open mouths drooling alcohol-seasoned saliva. One man blubbered in a corner, still going on about Basil.
Battles have been fought, and many gave their lives, but all who died by axe and sword were called to haul up high.
If this is what Valhalla is like, he'd be okay in hell.
Our time here is now at an end, can't help but reminisce.
Right, it was time to leave.
A cold spring day, so long ago, when we set out to sea. Oi, rider!
Hiccup knocked back the rest of his glass and slammed its empty shell down so hard it jolted a neighboring Viking out of his alcohol-induced slumber. He spun in his seat, one leg over the bench, standing.
I'm not...
Girls. His voice died in his throat before he registered anything else because, somehow, he instinctively knew he didn't want to be shouting into the face of the two women standing well within arm's reach of his body. Certainly not after drinking so much alcohol. Halfdan's stupid, cheery face hovered over the pair of ladies' heads like a bad omen. The alcohol made itself known with a vengeance as soon as his equilibrium changed. Dizziness clamped over his head like a vice, and he had to press a hand firmly to the table to keep from toppling over. His face felt hot, and he swore it was the drink, not the girls encroaching on his personal space. And Hiccup knew for a fact that he did have hands and feet, even if he couldn't feel them at the present moment.
I'd like you to meet Doris.
Halfdan pointed to the taller woman with dark curly hair tied up in several head rings.
And Hagna.
The other woman, Hagna, had her head covered with a shawl, with just the bare whips of brown hair peeking out. Her face lacked Dora's initial beauty, but her eyes were dark and intense, and Hiccup felt intimately exposed with the way she leveled her stare at him.
Neither speak Norse, Halfdan continued, and they both know you as the mysterious dragon rider. You're all set.
Hiccup blinked, moving his eyes from Doris's wide, predatory smile and onto Halfdan's.
What?
He asked dumbly. If he had just said no to those last couple of drinks, he would have understood immediately and not have things explained to him by a Viking. Hell, if he had said no, he wouldn't even be in the situation. Halfdan had a hand on either girl's shoulder, possibly responsible for keeping them in such a close proximity to him. Hiccup suspected he was leaning backwards in a subtle arc, but perspectives remained a bit distorted.
I explained the situation to them. You were raised by dragons, and I have never known the touch of a woman.
Halfdan looked rather proud of himself. Oh no. Now he got it.
Are they prostitutes?
He asked, nervous but frank. They didn't understand Norse, so they couldn't get offended, right?
They're courtesans, not common harlots, and they're good girls.
Halfdan redefined.
Good friends of the guard for a while now. Oh, don't be like that now.
Hiccup was shaking his head.
No,
he voiced firmly.
No, absolutely not.
Halfdan appeared irritated, but not swayed.
You're 16 and yet to experience a woman. It's got to happen sometime.
Maybe so, but not like this, not with strangers. Doris would not stop smiling at him. It was very distracting. Hiccup tried not to look at her, but something about the flash of her teeth and the curve of her eyes kept drawing him in like a magnet. And Hagny managed to make him feel naked with that stare. He could hardly look at her.
Come on now,
Halfdan urged, giving the girls a gentle push towards him, as if they could get any closer. With a deft move otherwise unheard of under such inebriation, Hiccup managed to slip past Hagny in a marginal opening. No longer trapped between the girls and the table, Hiccup also lost his support, and he teetered for a moment, trying to regain balance. His face continued to burn. Thoughts of what Halfdan and the girls expected him to be doing with them plagued his mind against his will. Even after all he had drunken, it wouldn't sit well with him.
No,
he insisted, shaking his head.
No prostitutes, courtesans, whatever. That's all kinds of awkward.
And, too, he would not know what to do with one. Maybe that was the problem.
You gotta trust me on this, kid. Go on.
Halfdan looked so hopeful, Hiccup almost felt bad. He couldn't. It was too weird. He didn't know them.
Sorry,
he said to the girls, both of whom looked confused and crestfallen. He was the rider. He was a novelty. Hiccup ignored Halfdan's calls for him to come back as he buried himself into the writhing mass of musical bodies, intent on escaping the tavern as soon as possible. He had a lot to sleep off. Hiccup panted. Even when exposed to Miklagard's winter air, and a laughable winter it turned out to be, sweat continued to bead along his forehead and seep through his shirt. His arms shook, having just countered a strong blow from a man who swung his sword around like a club. Not a particularly refined art, but quite effective, having been on the receiving end more times than Hiccup could count. He had only himself to blame for the ache in his arms. He lagged in his dodge. He had to block. There was no getting around it. This opponent was bigger than him. Most Vikings he'd ever face would be, and Hiccup had to resign himself now to this disadvantage. But disadvantage didn't mean failure. Throughout his training, Hiccup adhered to a number of simple truths entailing to his shortcoming. Stay out of his opponent's reach, or get in his personal space and use smaller size as an advantage. Body shots were pointless. He didn't have the strength to put a dent in the man. Go for extremities or a soft point, but only if it didn't leave himself vulnerable. One hit from his opponent could take him out. Good thing Hiccup had a talent for crippling via extremities. The enemy broadsword flashed forward again with a fearsome strength powering its strike. It was a long arc, forceful, intent to lead Hiccup into struggling under another blow to weaken him further. The best thing Hiccup learned from Domokos, even more so than his bow skills, was core strength. It always came back to core strength. He was tight, had complete control over his weight, able to switch directions at a moment's notice. He danced out of the sword's path faster than its wielder could keep up. Hiccup's greatest boon fell to his footwork, slipping in and out of arm's reach, managing sudden attacks from the side, feinting and dodging, all only possible because his feet brought him there first. Parry, don't block. Parry, don't block. The mantra flowed through his mind as a great arm swung at him, the blade attached merely an extension of the control charge. Hiccup bobbed and weaved, tapping the strikes to the side to throw the man off kilter with the force of his own weight. Usually this would have been effective enough for Hiccup to take the advantage on a direct attack, but this particular contender was too experienced to stumble. Hiccup's own blade, forged by his very hands and modeled after a Hungarian saber, did a remarkable job standing up to the thick, heavy metal of a Viking sword. Its weight allowed for it to follow Hiccup's quick, light movements, its slight curve giving a new element to the joining of weapons, helping direct the slide of other metals. This wasn't a weapon to strike directly with. This was a sword meant for flying actions and unseen attacks. But, above all, the very most important thing Hiccup learned about fighting larger opponents was to never fight fair. He didn't fight to show off, he didn't fight for honor, he fought to survive. And surviving often meant winning. Hiccup grunted as he leapt back, just barely missing a skimming blade to the stomach. Earlier blows from inabilities to divert started to wear on him, and while his opponent, swinging around for more mass, looked just as tired as he felt, Hiccup knew he needed to end this. The Viking was in the end of his lunge, quickly catching his weight after missing his intended target and redirecting it for another fine arc of his sword aimed at Hiccup's neck. Hiccup ducked under the swing, helped it by with his saber, and popped back up from the swift dip, this time stepping forward into the brief opening of the larger body. He dragged his sword down the other's length, keeping it at bay as he entered the danger zone. His move was sudden, unpredictable to the pattern he had intentionally set up, but against such an opponent, a risky move would not go unpunished. Fighting a right-handed man meant they had mirroring sides of armed and unarmed hands. They both shared same-sided openings. Sure enough, Hiccup felt a crunching pain in the soft area of his back, just above his hip bone, as the older man swung a punch with his free hand. At the same time, Hiccup succeeded in driving a sharp, precise fist into the yielding base of the man's neck. He could feel the throat drive inwards at his blow. The Viking staggered back by a half-step, shocked, eyes bulging as the previously abusing hand clutched the damaged area. The sword arm lost its strength, relinquishing its unconscious push against Hiccup's saber. It wasn't good enough. Hiccup needed him down. Hiccup spun around the gagging man and adroitly kicked the back of his knee. It buckled. The man, still fighting for oxygen, stumbled forward, finally dropping to one knee.
Dirty, Harold made a noise between a grunt and a cough. "Dirty trick." Though victories were few and far between for Hiccup, he never seemed to have the energy to celebrate.
"I think you made something explode,"
Hiccup grimaced, rubbing the very tender area of his back. Thankfully, it was far, far lower than his axe wound. Harold bared his teeth at the complaint.
"I cannot breathe."
The little brat was a terror when he really wanted to win. Harold would be the first to admit his initial admiration of the lad's latent sword skills, and they had only grown from there. Someone had done a spectacular job training him in the basics, because the foundation of his knowledge gave Harold a steady-minded student to build upon. But Hiccup's methods of making up for his lack of strength and size annoyed him to no end. The lad actually bit Harold once, and the man had been reluctant to put the boy in too many holes since. Hiccup had yet to go for the groin in a fight, but Harold knew it was only a matter of time. The Viking stabbed the tip of his sword into the compact dirt and used it as an aid to hoist his weight off the ground. Across from him, Hiccup continued to pout and massage his side, going from a determined fighter to a wounded kitten in an instant. Harold shook his head. The lad fostered an underlying drive to excel, a thirst to succeed. He would have commended Hiccup on maintaining such a Viking-oriented trait if he didn't think he'd be bitten for it. Again.
Ugh.
Harold cleared his throat and took a deep breath, testing his ability to function. Air filled his lungs with a slight rattle. It would do.
"You did good. You're getting better. You're still going to learn how to use your legs. They're longer than your arms. If you got the right control and strength over them, we'll make for some devastating blows."
"Yeah," Hiccup sighed, abandoning his back.
"I keep forgetting." "Practice until it's instinct," Harold lectured him. "Use the bag."
Hiccup absently nodded in assent. Halfdan had delivered a burlap sack on a post to his room, one apparently meant for training. Hiccup didn't know what was in it, but it could hardly be called soft. After the first day, he learned to bandage his knuckles and wrists for support and protection. He punched it daily to improve his strength, each time imagining it was a different Varinja face, and that his wrists hadn't broken yet was a good sign. He needed power behind each deceptive punch. Hiccup's body grew stronger with each day, gradually filling out with all his hard work, erasing the marks left by the Varinja's actions, bearing the scar on his back. His stamina had increased exponentially by now, to where he felt normal. He could run circles around Halfdan, much to the man's chagrin, and while Halfdan never challenged Hiccup to races, Hiccup knew he could beat him as well.
"You're going to learn how to grapple next,"
Harold announced, and Hiccup winced. He excelled in dancing out of people's reach. Grappling sounded like a situation that would force him to learn a new winning tactic. It also sounded like he would pay for that throat strike.
"All right,"
Hiccup conceded. He fiddled with the sword tie on his belt. Harold rubbed his throat one last time, eyeing the young man. The kid had so much potential as a great Viking. He had everything but the size. The Viking shook his head. More's the pity that potential would never be realized. Who knows? Maybe, somehow, there was a step up from Viking in this world, and the rider would be the first to reach it. Kid was still a brat.
"Practice your kicks,"
Harold left him with.
"I gave you 3 openings and you never took them."
Hiccup blinked at the abrupt parting, and then proceeded to spend the rest of the day thinking back on the spar, trying to pinpoint where. The past month and a half of working in the smith's shop tent turned out to be everything Hiccup dreamed it would. Not only did he have access to all the materials he once loved to have at his disposal, but he had his skills back up to standard under Demjan's rough and terrifying guidance. Learning the trade from different masters gave Hiccup the precious advantage of learning a whole new set of skills. Learning it under Demjan helped develop thicker skin against thinly veiled death threats. Being in a smith-based environment triggered old urges to resurface in Hiccup. He went back to carrying a notebook around with him everywhere, a new one with larger, cleaner pages, at first sketching the city rich with art and then moving on to his own ideas. Statues he would build if he knew how to carve stones, designs he would paint on vases. He recorded the architecture. He sketched the different faces found in the multicultural city, documenting the many types of people in the world. He sketched weapons he wouldn't use on dragons.
He subconsciously started to treat a corner of the tent as an office for personal projects, just as he had with Gobber, piling designs and half-finished personal projects in the delegated space. That earned him a quick reminder that Demian was not Gobber, as the man proceeded to drop anvils too close to his feet any time Hiccup left things lying about. Demian had yet to actually lay a hand on Hiccup, but Hiccup could have sworn he'd come close a couple of times. Luckily, Demian wasn't there now, and whenever the man was absent, rarely, as he made it known he loathed the thought of Hiccup unsupervised, one of two things happened. Doris, the courtesan from the tavern, had taken to popping up around Hiccup's workspace, which Hiccup found rather unsettling. He confronted Halfdan about it, whom he was still mad at, but the man swore he had nothing to do with it. The woman would often watch him work, keeping a distance so not to get in the way, but providing such a distraction for him that proximity had no value. She didn't speak to him, not even in Greek. She would pop in, watch him work, smile at him, and leave. She would giggle, too, usually after he dropped something he shouldn't have dropped because he knew she was watching him. Her visits were infrequent and brief, and seemed to have nothing to do with her profession at all. Still, Hiccup knew better than to think she saw him as anything other than the rider. The other event Demian's absence caused was an opportunity for Hiccup to get out his stowed-away mess of a half-constructed tail fin. The original was destroyed, by the fall mostly, but Harold admitted to destroying the rest of it. He promised it was before the axe incident, but Hiccup hardly cared. It was time for an upgrade anyway. Oh, but how he wished for the blueprints. He built it before, and he could build it again. It was all in his head, and he had the matching live fin at his beck and call, but it would have gone so much faster if he had the written design on him. Hiccup also lacked the freedom he once had. Demian almost popped an eye right out of his socket when he saw the mess Hiccup had made after crafting the structure poles, and Hiccup learned to be more discreet with the task. What once took a single night ended up taking Hiccup well over a week, thanks to time constraints and the need to perfect the new design. Within the same week he went to the tanner, thinking he could refurbish the saddle, which looked a little worse for wear, when the tanner offered to make one for him. The man's generosity may have been attributed to having to touch Toothless in order to take measurements. Hiccup didn't care about underhanded reasoning. He'd be saving time and getting a better quality product than if he undertook the assignment himself. Sometimes having a cat deity for a dragon comes in handy. Speaking of said deity, Toothless had taken to hounding Hiccup off and on about his progress on the tailfin. Hiccup could not begrudge him for this. They both ached for the winds and the freedom again. Their grounded lifestyle carried with it the ill tinge of bad memories and a sense of captivity, even when treated well. Hiccup also found himself worried about Toothless's health. The dragon flapped his wings often, tried to keep them limber, glided short distances, but nothing could compare to being so high the air burned. The Night Fury's exercise was limited, and it had to have a negative effect on his mind and body. Hiccup wondered if dragons got sick from being grounded, if perhaps it caused a mental trauma that weakened their body in every fashion. It would certainly explain the unlikelihood of a grounded dragon's survival. Hiccup hammered away at his second-to-last bolt. The red-hot nugget sent up ember flakes as he slowly formed its head into a hexagon. He was on the home stretch. He'd have this tail fin done in moments. He would be able to test the smoother design for the fin control. He was going to get out of the city. It was high time he had. He was getting better than before, fitter. There were less and less things keeping him here. While it may be that, in the end, he benefited from coming there, it did little to counter the memories of what he went through. He saw the great city. He was over it. Something shuffled on the other side of the tent. Hiccup sensed movement. It couldn't be Doris. He never seemed to hear her coming until it was too late. "I'll clean it up," Hiccup pitched to who he was assumed was Demian. Hopefully he wouldn't get a hammer thrown at his head. Again. "Just let me finish this bolt." Lifting his head revealed a far different character than Demian, someone who had, more or less, avoided coming near Hiccup at all. Bolly, the man who had been set on humiliating him during his first introduction to Miklegard. Hiccup's nostrils flared, intense irritation springing on him along with the urge to start swearing. He pushed both feelings down. "What?" he prompted shortly, his voice sharp. He continued his work, but with many, many glances upward to keep tabs on the man. It made progress slow. Bolly moved forward, leisurely, stopping at a good distance from the boy. Perhaps he understood the likelihood of being stabbed with a hot poker.
I heard from some of the other men that your mother grew up here.
Hiccup stilled only for a moment before resuming his hammering. So? He risked a glance to the open street, able to see Toothless sprawled across the corner of a flat roof. His tail dangled, flicking back and forth, his eyes narrowed on the visiting Viking.
Valka?
Bolly asked, sounding unsure. Hiccup turned his eyes back up to the man. Yeah.
Your mother was little Val?
Hiccup's heart clenched, suspense seizing his breath, and for that moment he didn't care about the history between him and Bolly. He cared only for the potential history between Bolly and his mother. You knew her? He didn't normally let his emotions slip like this around the Vikings. Not innocent emotions such as hope and wonderment, and certainly not in front of dubious characters such as this man. But he couldn't help it. His mother still existed in the very corners of the world she traveled. She left this world marked and branded with her presence.
My,
Bolly admitted with a deliberate nod.
She was just a wee lass herself when she first came here, and I was new to the Varinja, but it'll be hard to forget a girl like that. Made sure everyone knew who she was, she did.
Hiccup listened, his project abandoned, and he didn't care how eager or childish he behaved. This was why he came here. The first hint that turned his sights on the city. For the first time, Hiccup really looked at Bolly. He noticed the streaks of gray pulling at his temples and the lines of his forehead that didn't fade even after he relaxed his face. He could have been in Miklagard for ages. He honestly could have known his mother. Hiccup licked his lips, wanting to ask so many things. What was she like as a child? Was she scrawny too? Did she freckle? Or question incessantly? Or draw? He wanted to. But that element of pride he unintentionally nurtured over weeks past seemed to keep him from falling into total shambles. He doubted Bolly would answer anyway. The man was one of the handful of Vikings who would not accept his and Toothless's presence, too ingrained in his roots to ever attempt to get to know the pair of travelers. Not that they were willing on their end either. It could be entirely likely that Bolly came here simply to tease Hiccup with such information and leave. Bolly stared hard at Hiccup, seemingly able to see right through him.
So, you're her kid?
Hiccup, suddenly self-conscious, cleared his throat. He felt judged. Yeah, he replied, holding his head up a little more. He wasn't ashamed of being her child. Quite the contrary. At times he still felt the reverse might be true had she lived.
Huh.
And it was all Bolly said on the matter.
So she found herself a husband. Never thought she would, considering how averse she was to the idea of being tied down. Bit of an odd one, that girl.
Just like him. Hiccup hoped Bolly would go on, accidentally slip some more character into the woman sketched roughly through words, but the Viking seemed to catch himself when Hiccup leaned forward and better guarded his musings. No, she married, Hiccup said softly, a bit disappointed when Bolly stopped there. To a chief, he wanted to add, but felt the less information he gave out about himself, the better. Simply as a precaution. He didn't want these people to somehow be able to track him after he left. The Viking gave another slow nod, still looking at Hiccup with eyes that evaluated him.
So she did. And she let her son run halfway across the world on a dragon, did she?
The way Bolly worded it, that unsavory stare, it sounded critical, as if accusing Hiccup of being a runaway. Which he was, but not in the traditional sense. Hiccup understood, then, of the man's presence and of his indirect speech. Bolly didn't come here to meet Valka's son. He came here to condemn Valka's memory for having a son like him. She's dead, Hiccup returned with far more aggression than he planned. Suddenly, he didn't care if Bolly happened to be the last living connection to his mother outside of Berk. He wanted him out. He wanted him gone. He returned to hammering away at the nail, forging it with all the growing anger he felt.
Ah,
Bolly murmured, not sounding too shocked at the notion. He kept his features guarded better than the sisters, and Hiccup found himself annoyed with the man's continued non-committal responses.
How'd she go? Battle?
The hammering stopped, but Hiccup remained silent for a while longer, taking the opportunity to dip the clamped, tree-shaped bolt into a tub of lukewarm water. Then he moved a heavy gaze into Bolly's steel-blue eyes, the rising steam acting as a veil to soften the reply.
She was taken.
By? Hiccup cursed his eyes for flickering to Toothless's perch, visible to anyone who cared to look. He gave the answer away to his antagonist, but rather than wallowing in regret, his mind took the trigger as an opportunity to relieve every unguarded drunken word he'd heard about his mother. As a child he pieced together the story, a story his father was unwilling to speak to him about, and he concocted his own memory of it. He was only a babe, but the thought still haunted him. She had been taken by a dragon, the breed unknown to Hiccup, but he imagined it as a gronkel or a nightmare. She was taken defending him. Hiccup heard several murmured accounts by Vikings who hadn't seen him crawling around underfoot. A dragon tore off the roof and went for him, his mother reaching him just in time. Another account claimed he was outside for some reason, and that's why the dragon tried to attack his infant self. Wherever Hiccup was, his mother was there to save him, and was snatched by the dragon and carried off with the rest of the livestock. One woman claimed she saw the dragon, and that its talons had already pierced through her stomach, that she was carted off, limp and bleeding. That's how he remembered her. To this day, that's what he saw when he thought of his mother. Not the hugs or kisses she may have showered on her husband, not the way she might have cradled him as he slept. He thought of her as defeated, limp, punctured, food. So he tried not to think of her at all. Now he knew more, that his mother was dropped into the demon's awaiting mouth, as Toothless described.
She was taken,
he repeated, softer. His eyes glowed in the firelight flaring from the pit at his side, driving against Bolly's own intense stare. A charged moment passed between the men, an underhanded, subtle battle occurred where each indirectly accused the other of being connectedly responsible for her death.
She was taken and skewered like you skewered me.
Fine job of honoring her memory. Hiccup didn't know how long this battle of wills persevered. It could have been eternity, it could have been within a single breath, just like his mother's last. Neither man would take condemnation from the other. At long last, Bolly responded.
I guess you don't take after her too much, then,
he said lightly, as though he refused to acknowledge any sort of correlation to little Val's death and how he tried to kill her son. Hiccup bristled. It wasn't an insult to him, it was said as an insult to his mother. She wasn't as strong as him. She couldn't survive what he could. More than the man in front of him, Hiccup hated the thoughts that followed this perception, because a horrible, malicious part of his mind recognized this. He survived the fall that brought him into the custody of the Vikings, and the axe to the back, and the capture itself. Thinking back on it, it wasn't his link with Toothless that could take the credit. Even before, when he first learned to fix Toothless's flight, he took spills that left him limping for days, at velocities that, by all rights, should have broken his neck. He always got back up, a little worse for wear, but never broken beyond repair. Though smaller and frailer than the Vikings that surrounded him, his body was far more resilient than it appeared. He couldn't throw a punch to save his life back then, but he could take them. He did take them. He was never down for long. And then the flight, his chosen element, his safe haven, his love for dragons, everything that stole his mother from him. It must have killed his father, to know his weak son chose to be taken by a dragon, surviving something his brilliant, beautiful, capable wife couldn't. Hiccup's eyes lost their focus as he began the process of hammering the finished and cooled bolts into the fan joints. He was a disappointment to his father. Hiccup knew this. He accepted this, or tried to. But for the first time since learning how to hold his own, to live on his own, Hiccup wondered if he disappointed his mother. If she watched him from wherever she was, wounded at his decision to command and revel in the very situation that brought her to death. Perhaps he was overcomplicating the matter, but the irony was no longer lost on him. He traveled across the world with a subconscious goal to find a piece of his mother, only to realize he could have been spitting on her grave all the while. He felt a bit sick. "Leave," Hiccup commanded, hardly making it above a whisper. Volume wasn't necessary in such a situation. Bolly did as he asked, abandoning Hiccup to the bitter taste in his mouth that wouldn't allow a shred of joy in seeing the tail fin almost at a finish. "I didn't know that about your brute, Mother." Hiccup jerked. Several bolts clattered to the floor. "Ach!" he swore, bending down to pick up the nails. It served as a fine distraction to his bout of self-loathing. Yeah, it was a while ago." Toothless snuck his head into the tent, cocking it as he watched the boy busy himself. Hiccup wouldn't make eye contact with him. "You are still sad about it," he observed. Hiccup stood, shrugging one shoulder, still focusing on reorganizing his materials. "I think I'll always be sad about it." He cranked the last bolt into place, more than ready for a change in subject. "Come here, I want to see how this fits." The dragon allowed the transition, not wanting to pursue a subject that would only serve to sadden his human. He swung the back end of his body into the forge and presented his tail. "Didn't you take enough measurements to have it absolutely perfect?" Hiccup bent down, aligning the two fins. "Have to account for human error," he explained, tinkering with the buckles. "Ah, yes, the error of humans." Hiccup quirked his lips, the amusement feeling slightly less hollow. "So many errors." "So many." The boy finished strapping the new tail fin onto its host, pulling it open to its fullest extent. He still had a ways to go before all the flying gear was collected and assembled, but it was a start. "There," he declared, tugging on the prosthetic one last time. "How does that feel? Equal?" Toothless lifted his tail slightly off the ground, fanning his good wing. Yeah?" Hiccup looked so expectant that Toothless felt pain to reply honestly. "No, sorry, it's much lighter. Too light, actually. It'll throw me off." Strangely enough, Hiccup only brightened at his critique. "Good." Hiccup beamed, and he began to remove the fin again. "Because I have a brilliant and cunning plan." Toothless was always glad to see Hiccup smile after the boy experienced emotional turmoil, but his smile quickly turned into that smile. The one that, mixed with Hiccup's definition of brilliant and cunning, often led to more gray scales. "What?" he asked in apprehension. The dragon's tone reminded Hiccup that he would, in fact, need Toothless's consent to execute this plan. "Oh," his voice died a bit. "I guess I should get your permission first." "What?" Toothless repeated. The fact that Hiccup looked worried about getting his permission worried him. "When will you start shedding scales?" Hiccup asked instead. The dragon shed scales at seemingly random intervals to Hiccup, but apparently they made perfect sense to dragons. Sometimes the scales would fall off on their own, but usually Toothless would just rub and rub against hard surfaces, trees and rocks, until clusters of them fell. Hiccup was beating around the bush, working up to the central point. Toothless answered him anyway. "Usually not for many moon cycles. But if it's too warm, then much, much sooner. I'm growing faster. It could be as soon as 1 moon cycle, maybe 2. Why?" All thoughts of the plan fled Hiccup's mind, and he backtracked through Toothless's explanation. "Wait, you're growing faster?" The Night Fury did look a little bigger, and not just around the middle. The chest was broader, the tail longer, all things Hiccup wouldn't have noticed if it hadn't been pointed out to him. He spent every waking moment with the dragon when he could. He noticed Toothless's growth as much as he noticed his own. Something wasn't right. Dragons age too slowly for a human to see any difference. Hiccup's stomach plummeted. "Oh, gods, it's the bond. I didn't even agree to anything." Not officially. Subconsciously, he might have. "I made my choice. I want this," Toothless quickly assured him. It did little to quell the look of guilt on Hiccup's face. "You're scared," the human pointed out. He was scared, so Toothless had to be. Toothless was aging. Toothless was losing his life. "No," Toothless insisted. "It's different, and different is—" He wouldn't use scared. "Unusual." Hiccup wouldn't have any of it. "Unusual is just another term for different. You're scared." "Whatever," Toothless snapped. He'd never let Hiccup leave him first. "Why do you need to know about my scales?" Hiccup swallowed the need to push Toothless into explaining his feelings. He didn't want Toothless to feel scared and alone, but the dragon could be so obstinate about sharing his insecurities.
I want to make a coating of them on the tail fin, he blurted out, to match you. Of all the things Toothless expected, it wasn't that. The lack of immediate reaction had Hiccup feeling a tad anxious. It will be completely experimental. Maybe I could lay them like shingles, or maybe I could find a way to melt them. I don't know. It was just an idea. It's stupid. I can fix it to make it heavier.
No, Toothless stopped him. It's a good idea. Do it. Hiccup's eyebrows rose, hopeful.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. Oh, okay. Really? Yeah, you already said yes. Yes. Well, okay. Right, this will be fun. Then it'll be fireproof, too. Oh, I hadn't even thought about those types of benefits.
Does this mean we'll have to wait before we can go flying? This stopped Hiccup's inane mumblings. The boy's shoulders seized, and he looked apologetic at the dragon.
Yeah, I'm sorry, buddy.
It's fine. Toothless brushed off. Hiccup moved forward and placed a hand on Toothless's skull before the dragon could skulk off.
Thanks for being so patient with me.
You better not be referring to your recovery, Toothless began, voice teetering on the edge of dangerous.
I meant my crazy hobbies. I miss flying too, bud, but I really want to get this right. Make it better than before.
Like how you want to make yourself better than before.
Yeah,
Hiccup said softly, for the first time seeing the connection. You have ridiculous standards.
I know,
Hiccup grinned.
But look at who I have to measure up to.
He gestured to the dragon, playing up to the Night Fury's vanity. Toothless cocked an eyebrow, sitting up a little straighter. Your standards are acceptable. It was Apocreas in Miklagard. Hiccup didn't know all the details behind this 2-week-long event, other than it had something to do with Christianity and it involved the longest party he'd ever heard of. It also happened to be 3 days after his 17th birthday. So Hiccup pretended all the festivities taking place up and down the streets were for him, because hanging out with Toothless made him feel like it was okay to have silly, selfish thoughts, as long as they stayed inside his head. Unsurprisingly, Halfdan was at his side, Toothless at his other. Halfdan had already forced a drink down Hiccup's throat, and Hiccup led him. The incessant rain that served as a substitute for snow in this world cleared just in time for the carnival. The sun was warm on his cheeks, in the few times it broke out of the overcast, and the singing and dancing clogging every street were enough to help him tolerate even Halfdan's pushy nature. Toothless thumped his tail on the ground, watching the humans spin round and round in intricate patterns, his eyes occasionally drawn to flashing lights reflected from the jewelry-decorated partiers. He found these human celebrations as the most entertaining occurrence since he first saw himself in the mirror. Who knew that such problematic blights on nature could create such beautiful motions? "They're even better than you," he said excitedly to his human. His tail continued to thump in time to the music, uncontrolled.
"What?"
Hiccup scoffed in mock affront.
"You've never seen me dance."
And it was probably for the best. Hiccup only ever danced at tribal gatherings, and only when forced, where he spent more time tripping over his own feet than actual dancing. "Yes, I did," Toothless insisted. "That time when we first met, I made you do this." He gestured with his head at the line dancing. Hiccup rolled his eyes.
"I wasn't dancing," he stressed. "I was avoiding the lines, with flair."
"Flair is dancing."
"Whatever."
"Woman." Hiccup stared at the dragon, incredulous.
"Excuse me?"
Toothless nudged his nose towards the crowd. "It's that woman." Hiccup followed the nose and almost choked on his spit when he saw Doris approaching their group. She smiled at him, her dark eyes playful as she weaved her way through the last few bodies separating them. Hiccup began, feeling the oncoming of a strange panic, not knowing what to say when she stopped in front of him. But then she turned to face Halfdan and spoke to him in Greek. Hiccup's relief was short-lived. Halfdan's face lightened. He glanced at Hiccup, chuckled, and replied to her. "Dance." Doris beamed and repositioned herself directly in front of Hiccup. She leveled a finger at his face and said, very clearly, "Dance." Hiccup could feel his face frozen in shock, positive he had misunderstood such a simple and obvious request. Why would a prostitute want to dance with him? Not that it mattered to him what she did for a living. He didn't feel like embarrassing himself. Hiccup quickly found his voice.
"No."
"Yes," She was just as quick to counter. The young man spent a fleeting moment in stupefaction that she responded in Norse before realizing that, as a friend of the Varinja, she must have picked up a few simple words.
Do it.
Halfdan pushed, enjoying the entire scene unfolding before him. They had even started to get a few stares from surrounding celebrators, probably drawn to the sight of a woman approaching the two travelers.
Do it,
Toothless urged, and Hiccup whipped his head around, betrayal written all over his face. Before he could yell at Toothless for turning on him like this, he felt a small hand grab his wrist. "Dance," Doris said, again tugging him into the mass of dancers. "I don't know what I'm doing," he complained. He attempted to pull his arm back with no real force. "That's even better," Toothless crowed amidst Halfdan's obnoxious laughter. "You guys are complete asses." "Dance," Doris chirped again, wanting him to move faster.
"Remember, think human," Harold supplied.
Hiccup started what was sure to be a very rude gesture, but Doris had captured his other arm as well, leading him backwards into the union of dancers. "Dance! Good!" she said when she stopped them at the very perimeter of the circle of dancers. His unease must have been palpable, because her smile softened. Not bothering with any more words, Doris took his right arm and guided it to her waist. Hiccup couldn't stop the dry swallow that betrayed his nervousness as he tried to determine how tightly he should even be touching her. Her hip felt squishier than he thought it would. She wasn't firm with the muscle most Viking girls had in their youth, and she wasn't padded with meat and cruel insulation as older women were. She was just soft. She lightly pressed her front to his, and he could tell her body, everywhere, was soft. No muscle definition, not even in her arms, having never trained before in her life. But she was exceedingly feminine, from the pronounced curves shaping her clothes to the delicate arches of her face. He had never met anyone more traditionally woman. Doris took his other hand and held it out from their bodies. She held his gaze for a moment and smiled as if to say, "Ready?" Then she guided them into the fray. Hiccup's stomach flipped, not feeling quite ready at all for the action. He didn't even know why dancing made him feel nervous. Maybe he felt like there were too many expectations on him to perform in a certain manner. He had always felt that way, like he was thrown into situations because people wanted to see him fail at them. But, surprisingly enough, hardly anyone looked at them. Everyone was too busy dancing themselves, or clapping, or singing, or laughing, or drinking. No one stood out in this crowd except for Toothless, and as soon as Hiccup was dragged from his side, he regained a little more anonymity. Hiccup's feet were sluggish for a while. He focused on everyone around them, trying desperately to pick up the pattern of the dance, trying desperately not to look at Doris, and it didn't take long before he managed to. His eye for design came through for him. Then he focused on performance. Hiccup quickly found that if he pretended this was a training exercise, the movements came easier. Core strength and balance kept him from stumbling, rhythm and memory kept him on beat. He could do this. A tentative smile came to his face as the pair began to blend in with the rest. "Good," Doris said, just soft enough that the word could only be heard between them. Hiccup smiled wider, releasing a short laugh, drawing one from Doris as well. He twirled her in time with every other fellow's partner and brought her back to his arms. He did have fun. This was fun. Hiccup hadn't felt this playful in a long, long while. Certainly not since he came to Miklagard. He was no longer mad at Toothless for pushing him into this. They danced for 2 more dances, the music and partying never slowing, even as more and more clouds formed overhead. Eventually, the feet moved them to the very border of the dancing mass. A break in the onlookers revealed a narrow path into an alleyway between buildings, and Hiccup, too focused on dancing, didn't realize anything amiss until he found himself spun away from the circle of dancers. For a moment, dizziness took hold. He registered that it was suddenly darker, people no longer surrounded him, and the music and laughter of the celebration managed to become separated. Doris pushed Hiccup up against a wall. Hiccup felt small hands on his shoulders, driving forth a pressure he didn't think could come from such a body, and then he felt the hard surface of whatever structure was behind him against his back. Thank the gods he had healed enough for this kind of abuse. He was granted a brief reprieve of his confusion as his eyes came to focus on Doris's face, intense, focused, and determined, shadowed by the seclusion of their location. Then Doris stood on her tiptoes and pushed her mouth against his. Hiccup's mind immediately went into protest. He had told her no. Granted, that was weeks ago, but his decision hadn't changed. He didn't know her, so he wasn't comfortable with this. So why did the hands fall into her waist, not push her away? His logic fled quickly as his actions rebelled against his intent. He tried to grasp onto reason, tried to prevent his body from responding to her, but she had her fingers tangled in his hair, with nails scraping at the base of the strands to create an indescribable sensation that swooped from his scalp to the pit of his stomach. Why was she doing this? He didn't understand this. He sort of understood this. This was nothing like with Gudrid. Gudrid's affection for him was pure, innocent, and developed. He almost felt as much guilt and sorrow as he did passion when he kissed Gudrid. Doris was only passion. There were, near literally, no words to be spoken between them, only action. It was so raw with this woman, rough. She knew he rode a dragon and worked in a smith shop and wasn't interested in paid sex. She saw him as a conquest. These weren't good reasons to kiss him. He knew these things about Doris, so why was he only pushing back at her with his own mouth? Why did the thought of someone using him not turn him off? Perhaps because she came with no expectation from him. Hiccup's neck bent willingly with Doris's forceful tug on his hair. His eyes fluttered close, and in that defeat his awareness magnified. Her lips were every bit as soft as the rest of her, but far more toned. She captured and released his with just the right amount of tantalization that left him yearning for more. She'd linger over his mouth every now and then, her lips hovering with a gentle brush to give him an obvious opening to take action. And he took it. Tentative, Halfton was right about one thing, he wasn't experienced with women, but careful in returning actions he had read from her. Top lip, hold, bottom lip, draw. His mind felt sluggish, but his body was in overdrive. His pounding heart almost served as a distraction in its din, and there were certain parts of his mouth that, when she paid special attention to them, his stomach swooped and heat settled between his hips. This never happened before. It scared him, this sort of sensation. He couldn't deny that kissing her excited him, but he wanted to go slow. It was almost too fast for him. He didn't like this nervousness that aroused the very core of his being, because he couldn't pinpoint if it were good or bad. Of course, she picked up on this. The woman was a prostitute. She probably understood human cues the way Hiccup understood Toothless. Oh gods, was Toothless watching this? That would have been the one winning thought to break through this enchantment of lust, if Doris had not done something Hiccup hadn't known one could do while kissing. Her tongue entered his mouth. He gasped, froze, and allowed the muscle to gently poke past his teeth. This was weird. His lax jaw slowly parted to let her do what she wanted, because his fear and curiosity had grown too strong to fight it. Rain began to drizzle on their hats, and Hiccup could hear the muted cheers of the celebrators, none willing to be driven inside by the skies. The dancing continued. Doris continued. Her body was pressed flush against his, and for the first time he realized just how soft she was. He'd never had a woman against him like this, not willingly. He'd never had a woman rub a leg against the outside of his, or curl her arms around his neck to further lock him into a kiss he thought couldn't possibly get deeper. Feeling her tongue against his, smooth and stroking and tasting, was terrifying, enthralling, almost too much. He was shaking. She must have felt it, through the clothes that he gripped, through his chest that she hugged. He had to do something. He had to stop it. He had to continue it. His tongue tentatively passed over her bottom lip. He felt her teeth, the soft underside of her own tongue. It was wet. He'd never had his tongue in another human's mouth before. He'd never had another human's tongue in his mouth before. He'd never heard of this. The rain empowered her scent, spice and powder. The wall behind him, the dancers, the clapping, they all disappeared. He was falling. Was he breathing? His head was spinning. He could only sense her in this everlasting moment. It wasn't until she gently pulled away from him, drawing their kiss to a close, that Hiccup realized how tightly he held her against him, willingly. Of all the things to notice first, it was that he did hold his breath. He had to have been, to be breathing so heavily now. He wanted to say something, but the rain, though a mere drizzle, mixed with the afterglow of their kiss, made for a deafening atmosphere. He was sure he wouldn't have heard his own voice. So he stared at her, waiting for her to make the first move, seeing as she was so good at it. Doris's own chest rose and fell with each breath, more pronounced than usual with her attack on him, which meant she was breathless too. The rain had plastered the loose wisps of her hair to her temple, her lips were red and wet, her tongue darted out to taste them, and Hiccups suddenly saw her as beautiful. Wordlessly, she reached for his hand, the one still on her hip, slack. Hiccup watched as she lifted it to her eye level and began to trace her fingers over the scars of his knuckles. She ran soft hands, too soft to have ever held a weapon, over the newest ones, paying particular attention to the one he got in the forge. She was there. He hid a heated sword too close to his hand when he noticed her presence, and it burned him. She saw him receive the scar. She remembered.
"What?"
he finally croaked. He was back to not understanding. Doris brought the hand to her shining lips and kissed the scar, sending a jolt through Hiccup's body that struck his heart more than his loins. "Good," she murmured, and then, with one last coy look, she left him. Hiccup stood in that alley, in the rain, with bruised, moist lips, winded, and more problems than he knew what to do with.